Welcome students of Form 3B, and this video belongs to Chapter 2 about Caribbean groups and institutions. And we're going to look at a timeline of Caribbean ethnic groups. So how did different groups from different parts of the world came to the Caribbean, and mostly that also aligns with which groups also came to Curacao during the last few thousands of years. This video is about the sequence, so the years are mostly not so important, except during the modern times and the ending of slavery, the abolition of slavery, but it's about the sequence and also some context about how these groups arrived in the Caribbean. So it's about the sequence of events, mostly, and it's about the context in which this group arrived in the Caribbean. I will make a second video later on in which I specify it concerning Curacao. And I also make clear I cannot go into each detail because this is a video for social studies and not for history. So if I do not incorporate some parts of the history, that is because I need to be not thorough, I need to be generic. So some things I will leave out, and that's consciously. That's a choice of leaving some things out. Timeline of Caribbean ethnic groups, and we already talked about it in class. An ethnic group is a group who lives somewhere but together has origins in another part of the world and share a lot of the times their culture, their language, and their customs. Yes, and the three, actually four main topics are migration, like you can see above, migration, so a period of migration. We begin with a period of colonization, and in our times, a period of abolition of slavery in the Caribbean, and a period of industrialization. So these are the main themes, topics. And this is a timeline, like you can see here, and a sequence of events, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, means that we have a certain line of events. This is the most old event, and this is still going on in Binti Binti 5 y Binti Binti 4. It's still going on, dignos tempo, in our time. Yes, but it's about the sequence of events. So what was first and what came later, concerning, of course, our region of the Caribbean. Yes, the timeline of the arrival, entrega, of the different Caribbean ethnic groups. And we start with migration. Yes, Amerindians migrated to the Caribbean mainly from South and Central America. So they came from here, they migrated into the Caribbean, and they came from there. During 5,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago, and even way back, they came not so much from North America, but they came from Central America. There's this, Panama, Belize, Mexico, towards the Caribbean, and from what is now Venezuela and Colombia. Venezuela here and Colombia there, and the Guianas, you cannot see them, but they are here. From those areas, people migrated, people traveled, people settled into the Caribbean. Yes, the Amerindians. And this started some 6,000 years ago and perhaps even earlier. So these groups came to the Caribbean from the Guianas, from Venezuela, and also from Central America, parts of the world we call now, but they weren't back then, of course, Belize, Nicaragua, Panama, Mexico, and many other Central American countries. They didn't exist yet. So the lines on this map didn't exist yet, of course, 4,000 years ago. And they migrated to the Caribbean. And this period of migration lasted for thousands of years until the period of colonization that started in 1492 AD. So when we talk about time, we have the concept of BC. BC stands for before Christ. So 2000 years ago, we said that Christ was born, and we also have AD, that's after the birth of Christ. Yeah? AD means Anno Domini, it's Latin for the year of our Lord. So this all happened 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 years ago, some 4,000 before Christ. Yeah, it's like looking at temperatures. You have below zero and you have above zero. And that's why you have before Christ, and you have AD, Anno Domini, the year of our Lord, after Christ was born. Yes, most historians regard Christ as a historical person, the core of it, and we say that he was born más o menos 2,000 years ago. And some even say he was born exactly 2024 years ago, but probably we're wrong in that. But that's another matter. Colonization. So we talked about the Amerindians. We're now going to talk about colonization. So Columbus, Cristobal Colon, Christopher Columbus arrived in the Caribbean in 1492 AD, more than 500 years ago. So this is the year of our Lord, 1492 after Christ was born, actually. The Spanish and also the Portuguese were the first to colonize islands and mainland Caribbean. For example, the Portuguese colonized Brazil, almost 40–50% of South America. When you look at Curacao, the Spanish were the first to arrive in Curacao and many other islands in the Caribbean. So when we look here to our islands, the Spanish were the first to colonize what is now the Dutch Caribbean. They arrived in Aruba, they arrived in Curacao, Statia, St. Martin. The Spanish arrived first. Yes? And later others, like the Dutch, like the Danes from Denmark, you didn't know probably, but they also colonized the Caribbean, the British, and of course the French. So later, other European countries followed actually. The Europeans. Yeah, 1492, the Spanish came and the Portuguese, and afterwards, during the end of the 16th century, also the Dutch, the French, the British, and others, like the Danes, also colonized the Caribbean. As early as 1518, Africans were brought in to do the hard labor in the mines, but also on the plantations and also on the farms, because the indigenous people of the Americas became sick, became sick because the Europeans brought diseases to the New World. They didn't know, by the way, that the Europeans themselves didn't know, but they brought diseases to the New World. So as early as 1518, and again 1518 AD, the year of our Lord, more than 500 years ago, Anno Domini, Africans were brought in, and they were used as forced laborers, so they were forced to work, and this became slavery pretty quick, where African slaves were bought in Africa, in Western Africa to be precise, and brought to the Caribbean as early as 1518. So very early in the 16th century, Africans were brought in to the Caribbean, into Belize, for instance, into Curacao, for instance, and also into Jamaica, for instance, and all the other areas of the Caribbean, even into Venezuela. Africans were brought in to do the hard work, and this ended up becoming slavery pretty fast during the history. This was a very important part of the history of the Caribbean, because now we get the mix of the Europeans, the Africans, and what's left of the Amerindians, because a lot of them, millions of these groups died because of the diseases that were common to the Europeans, but not so common for the Amerindians. So millions of them died. We have some left on islands like Dominica, for instance, and other islands, Aruba. Some genes, some parts of the population have ancestry belonging to the Amerindians, to the Kaigatil, but not much of them are left anymore, unfortunately. And this period of colonization and this period of bringing in African slaves by the Europeans, by the Dutch, the British, by the French, lasted for more than 300 years. Even like in Cuba, for instance, it lasted until the end of the 19th century, actually, almost 400 years, you could say. Yeah, but more than 400 years, African slaves were brought into the Caribbean. And for instance, Cuba did this for long into the 19th century. So well over 300 years, actually, this lasted. And Africans were brought in during these years. So Africans were brought in for countries into the Caribbean for well over 300 years, actually. Well over. Then the Amerindians and the Chinese are brought in, and this is the period of abolition and industrialization. And later on, also people from Lebanon and Syria are actually brought in. So the Indians and the Chinese are brought in, and this is the period of industrialization and also the period of abolition. We call this period also the period after the abolition of slavery, or we also say post-emancipation. So after the abolition of slavery, during the second half of the 19th century, indentured laborers were brought in the Caribbean. Later others followed, for instance, people from Syria and from Lebanon. We call these the ethnic groups that belongs to Lebanese people and Syrian people, or those of the Arabs. So after the abolition of slavery, other people had to work on the plantations, and those were the Chinese and the Indian people. When slavery was abolished, cheap labor, obrero barata, if I say it correctly, obrero barato, cheap labor had to be brought in, and the Europeans, the Dutch, the British, the French, and others found a solution for this issue in bringing in people from China and bringing in people from India. Yeah? And later on, the Portuguese from Madeira and the Arabs from Syria and Lebanon were actually brought in to the Caribbean to also do the work, not so much on the plantations, but more in the sugar refineries and actually in the oil refineries. They had expertise, não tem conhecimento, for the oil refineries and the factories that were built in the Caribbean. And people from Madeira were brought in to work sometimes in the plantations, but also to do the work in the factories and the oil refineries. People from Syria and Lebanon we also call Arabs. There are people from the Arabic world that speak an Arab language. So that happened at the end of the 19th century. So this happened, Esakita Sosede, during the second half of the 19th century, but also during the beginning of the 20th century. So the end of the around after 1850, but also well after the 1900s, well after the year 1900, into the century in which I was born, the 20th century, this happened. People from Madeira, the Portuguese came in, and also Arabs from Syria and Lebanon came in. And when you look at Curacao, we see many of these groups until today living in Curacao. So we have in the 19th and the 20th century people from the Arab world coming in, like you see in the picture next to here. We see people coming in from other parts of the world. This is Madeira, by the way. This is a part of Portugal, across the coast of Morocco. That is a possession of Morocco. And people from mixed descent, but mainly Portuguese, African, and Arab descent live there. And they have migrated to Curacao at the beginning, at the end of the 19th, but mainly the beginning of the 20th century, because the refinery came here. And just after abolition, people from India and China, they recognize which country this is. This is China and this is India. They came in the Caribbean, mainly after the abolition of slavery, to do the work on the plantations. On Curacao, this was a bit different because we didn't have that much plantations here. So the Chinese and the people from India mainly came in during the time of the arrival of the refinery around 1915, they came into Curacao because of the construction of the refinery. So after 1915 AD, the Chinese and people from India came in because of the wealth that was brought in by the refinery, and they started their own companies and enterprises. Yes, people from India and China. And why? Because of the arrival of the Shell and the refinery on Curacao. After 1915, when the refinery was built on Curacao, and after the 1920s, when the refinery was built on Aruba. There it wasn't the Shell, it was the Lago over there. And also a lot of people from Portugal, Madeira to be precise, and Arabs and Chinese and people from India came to Curacao because of that. I hope you found this video helpful and informative. If you have questions, ask them below. And of course, I'm missing out many things, but that's on purpose because it's about the ethnic groups that came to the Caribbean. It's about the sequence, and the years, except a few exceptions, are of lesser importance. If you have questions, ask them please below. If you want to subscribe, ring the bell, please do that. And if you have questions, ask them by using Teams and using the chat, using the messages below, or asking them during class. Enjoy your day, and I hope you found this video very informative.